This is the moment that you've all been looking for. Teenage Brain Development Part 2, coming at you live from Casa de Pay. That is French, I believe, for Mr. Pay's castle. So in this part, we're going to be looking at the second R of the three R's of teenage brain development, the reward system, or the dopamine pathways in our brain. And we'll be looking at differences between the reward system and the way the reward system functions in the teenage brain, in contrast to how the reward system works in the adult brain. We've already looked at the relationship system or the social brain. You'll begin to see how all of these are very closely intertwined and how there's a great deal of overlap between the three. Do you know what else starts with R? Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare's classic tragic tale of teenage love. And I think Shakespeare's play really exemplifies some of the qualities or terms that have often been used to describe teenagers and adolescents. Things like that they act quickly and impulsively without thought or care. The fancy SAT word for that is impetuous. Teens are often described as being moody and melodramatic or overly emotional. Teens are often accused of changing their mind, attitude, or feelings easily and often. Another word for that is the word fickle. When someone is fickle, they are quick and easy to change their mind or their feelings. Their attitudes are easily changed. They might feel one way one moment and complete opposite way another moment. So teens are often accused of being fickle. Teens are often accused of having a tendency toward excessive risk-taking and sensation-seeking. They are known to defy rules and distrust of authority. They're known for being passionate, creative, and imaginative. And one way of sort of summarizing a lot of these is sort of emotional roller coaster. The highs are higher than the highs. The lows are lower than the lows. As we'll see, the limbic system is pretty much turned up to 100 in the average teen. And so Shakespeare sort of, he was ahead of his times in many ways. And he describes Romeo and Juliet as having a lot of these qualities. There are other characters in the play that have these qualities as well. Mercutio and Tybalt come to mind, if I'm remembering my English classes correctly. In my mind, Romeo and Juliet it's not just a classic tragic love story, but the tragedy in many ways is due to all of these qualities that we see listed here. And now we have the neuroscience to understand these things. So today we're going to be looking at the second R, or the reward system. Let's review some of the basics of the reward circuit or pathways in our brain and how that works. So the reward circuit of our brain is a group of structures that are activated when we experience something rewarding or pleasurable. And this can be both a physical reward, like a donut or your favorite food, or it could be a social reward, like a compliment or a like, or a mental reward, like solving a puzzle or a math equation. In other words, a reward is any stimulus that we find pleasurable. And although there are vast differences in the types of things each person finds rewarding, the way that the reward system works in the brain is the same for everyone, whether the reward is a donut or a favorite food, a social media like, or solving a difficult puzzle. When exposed to a rewarding stimulus signaling the potential of a reward, the brain responds by increasing the release of a neurotransmitter called dopamine. Now, as recently as 40 or 50 years ago, we used to think that dopamine was essentially the same as the pleasure from receiving a reward. But now we know that it's a bit more complex than that, and that dopamine is actually can be activated before the reward is even received at all, and that it can particularly be activated and released in high levels in anticipation of the reward. So this is an important distinction. Remember from earlier this year that the nucleus accumbens, which you can see in the diagram on the upper right there, is the region of the brain that is at the center of our reward system. The nucleus accumbens, when we perceive a potential reward in our environment, sends dopamine out to other parts of the brain to help us remember that we liked something and to tell us to do that again in the future. In other words, it's saying, that felt good, so I'd like to do it again when I get a chance, so I want to remember that. The nucleus accumbens is hypersensitive and highly developed in adolescence, but we'll talk more about that later. So remember also, if we could think of the amygdala as sort of the yappy, which is the yappy chihuahua in our brain. It goes into high alert with any perceived threat. It's our brain's so-called monster detector, telling us what things in our environment to avoid. Then we can think of the nucleus accumbens as our brain's donut detector, and that it tells us what things in our environment that we should approach. So this is what we would call approach and avoid behavior. The nucleus accumbens, through the release of dopamine, tells us what types of things in our environment we should approach, and the amygdala reacts when it perceives a threat in our environment and tells us which things we should avoid. A couple more things to review about dopamine. Remember that there are at least 100 different types of neurotransmitters produced by the brain. But dopamine is the most important when it comes to the reward system. It's released whenever our brain believes we should take strong note of our current behavior and remember it. Its levels rise in response to pleasurable experiences like eating or shopping or beating a high-level boss finally in a video game. It is essentially saying to our brains, remember this and do it more. And this creates a memory loop in our brain that continues to reinforce that habit. So we keep coming back for more and more and more, and we keep seeking the high and the craving of that dopamine surge in our brain. So some rewards, like reproductive rewards and food, we see a dopamine release in pretty much every animal species examined that has dopamine in their brain. But for humans, just thinking about things with our high level of cognitive function, our ability to think in the abstract in terms of concepts and to think in terms of metaphor, we can get a dopamine release from merely symbolic things. Physical things like food, your favorite food, that causes dopamine release in pretty much anyone if they're hungry. But there's an added twist in humans. We can simply see a picture or a word that represents the food, and it can cause that dopamine release and that craving to acquire that food. That is essentially the neuroscience behind the success of advertising. We see images on a screen that make us crave a fancy new car or our favorite food or a type of sweater. And this causes that craving that the ad makers hope will be strong enough for us to approach and buy that item. So our dopamine reward system actually can also respond to things that are aesthetic, like art and music. There was a study in which people listened to new music and they measured the brain activity in the nucleus accumbens in their brain. And the higher level of nucleus accumbens activation when they listened to the music meant that they were more likely to actually purchase that particular music. So also, real quick, just remember how things, neurotransmitters, function at the level of the synapse. And here we can see a close-up of a synapse between neuron A at the top, the end of the axon, and neuron B, the bottom, the dendrite, which is receiving a signal through neurotransmitters from neuron A. So we see the little neurotransmitter molecules travel across the synapse there, and they're hoping to bind to the receptor on the dendrite of the neighboring neuron. So also remember that a neurotransmitter must find an exact fit in terms of the receptor. So a dopamine molecule will need to find a specific dopamine receptor in the neighboring neuron in order to bind and latch and to send the signal on. This is often described as the way that a key fits into a specific lock. Each neurotransmitter has a specific molecular structure that fits into a receptor, which is precisely designed for it. Okay, enough about dopamine at the level of the neuron. Let's look at how this works through looking at a classic study involving monkeys. Yes, I know that is not technically a monkey, the image on the upper left, but a chimpanzee. But the study that I'm about to talk about did involve monkeys and raisins. Apparently, monkeys really like raisins. We all know they like bananas, but they also like raisins a lot. And so this was a situation, a study was set up in which a monkey was living in a room, and when a light would go on over the door, that light would signal that a lever in the room was active, and if the monkey was willing to do the work of pushing the lever, let's say 10 times, then after a certain lapse in time, raisins would come down a chute, and the monkey would be really happy to have these raisins. So once the pattern had been established that the light goes on, signaling to the monkey that the lever is now active, which means that the monkey can do the work that is involved, pushing the lever, and then thus a reward will be available after a brief period of time. So monkey goes over to the lever, presses 10 times, gets the raisin reward. This has happened often enough that there's this increase in dopamine with each raisin as the number of raisins goes up. So monkey receives one raisin, a little bit of dopamine. If it continues just to receive that one raisin, then that dopamine level is going to level out. But if it is increased to 2, then it's going to be another surge in the dopamine levels released. And this is sort of why we crave more and more of something and aren't satisfied with the same amount. So remember earlier I mentioned that dopamine is not just associated with receiving the reward, but the anticipation of the reward. And here in this chart on the right with the curves or humps, you can see the level of dopamine that was released. So there's 3 parts of this process. The signal or cue, in this case, it would be the light that goes on that signals to the monkey that the lever is now active. Then after the light or signal goes off, the monkey knows that if they do the work, it's the second part of the process. Then after a lapse in time, after they do the work, that a reward will come. And here you can see once the pattern is established, light means eventual raisin, then the anticipation of the reward causes a much higher dopamine surge than the actual receiving of the reward. So we see that larger bump with the signal, the anticipation. I'm going to be getting some raisins. That motivates the monkey to do the work, and then we get another slight dopamine surge or bump when the actual reward is received, but it's not as high as the anticipation. And this is a central dynamic in understanding the behavior of higher level animals like ourselves. Now, another interesting thing and an even more powerful motivator of behavior is what's just called variable reward. Variable reward. Variable reward. Say it with me. Variable reward. And this involves rewards that are uncertain or rewards that are inconsistent in their amount. So we can see another chart here. This is, let's say that rather than a raisin coming out each time that the monkey did the work, let's say that the researchers mixed it up a little bit. So only half of the time a raisin will come out. This really causes a big surge in the dopamine levels in the monkey brain, and as we know now, human brains as well. So we see that regular bump. You see the dotted line is when the monkey gets the raisin only half the time, 50%. Notice that new, even higher bump there. between the moment of the work having been done and the reception or the receiving of the reward. That is the largest dopamine spike. So that is a really powerful motivator of behavior. So this doesn't just mean variable reward, doesn't just mean that we get a reward only some of the time. It can also represent uncertainty in terms of the size of the reward. So let's use scratch-off lottery tickets, for example. One reason, a huge factor in why scratch-off lottery tickets are so successful is when you buy one, you don't know what you're going to get. You could spend $1 for a ticket and get nothing in return. You could spend $1 for a ticket and get $5 in return as a reward. You could spend $1 for a ticket and very rarely get $5,000 for a reward. So no reward, a little bit of reward, a very, very large reward. This really causes this sort of second big bump. So in this case, a signal would be that lottery tickets are available. A person that liked lottery tickets driving by the convenience store that sells the lottery tickets. That would signal to them, be a cue, that there are lottery tickets in there. That would get them to do the work of going in the store, stopping going in the store, paying money that they'd actually spent, that they had worked for to earn, paying their money. And so we would see different levels of dopamine release in that process. But the highest dopamine level of release would come in that moment of actually scratching off the tickets. And the designers of these tickets know this. That's why they have so many areas to scratch off in a single ticket, because it takes that time. And the time that someone is scratching off the ticket, that dopamine level is rising and rising and rising in their brain, because they are uncertain whether they're going to get no reward. They're uncertain whether they're going to get a small reward, and they're uncertain whether it could be a big reward. So that variable reward, there, I got it right that time, of uncertain or inconsistent rewards is a hugely powerful motivator of human behavior. We see it. Another example are the popularity of loot crates in video games, or video games that have microtransactions. Think about a video game that you've played that may have a loot crate or virtual card packs that you open. Usually there's an animation. You click on it to open the pack that you've earned through doing work in playing the video game, or sometimes paying for the microtransaction. You don't know whether you're going to get something rare in that loot crate or virtual card pack, or something very common. And so, but they delay, the designers of those games typically place an animation, a short animation, in the moment when you click to open the pack or the crate, and the moment when you see what the reward is, because they know how powerful that dopamine surge is between the moment when you click, the moment of waiting and anticipation, that second huge bump, and when you actually find out how large or small your reward might be. Variable reward is also at the center of the design of many apps that designers hope to profit with by causing us to go back and back and back. We get that dopamine surge by leveling up in an app, or getting likes, or getting rewarded for steps, for example, might be a positive use of variable rewards. The reward for Fitbit, for example, by reaching a certain level of leveling up. Video games has this as well. So variable rewards, a very powerful motivator of a lot of human behavior. Any questions? Just kidding, you can't ask questions right now. So let's look at another study involving teenagers. Now we're going to start to look at how the reward system in the teenage brain is different from the reward system in adults' brains. And so this will involve several MRI, or magnetic resonance imaging studies. Remember that MRIs can actually measure which regions of the brain are becoming activated when the participant is engaged in certain activities. In this case, the researchers asked themselves the question, what is something that most people find rewarding? Now, a couple things might come to mind, but one thing that the researchers settled on is sugar. Most people like sugar. So in this case, participants were hooked up with a specially designed MRI machine that had a straw that released sugar water into their mouth. And so we would see what parts of the brain would light up when they would get that little sugar being released. So first of all, they were asked, how much do you like sugar? And you can see in the red bar, teenagers typically like sugar more than adults. No surprise there. But is there something, neuroscience, we can use neuroscience to represent this difference. So across all age groups, when we did this experiment, as expected, we saw activation in the nucleus accumbens during the reward. Remember the nucleus accumbens, so you can see there on the slide, the location of it, right there, sort of in between the limbic area and the main part of the PFC. Nucleus accumbens sends out a flood of dopamine out to the rest of the brain when we see a potential reward in our environment. So no surprise, high levels, all age groups, release of dopamine from the nucleus accumbens, high brain activity in the nucleus accumbens. But here you can see there was an immense difference in the level of activation in the nucleus accumbens. Again, the red bar, teenagers, the white bar, adult. So in receiving that sugar water through the straw, there was a much higher level of activation in the nucleus accumbens of teenagers. So researchers wanted to make sure that it wasn't just sugar. So they found another thing that pretty much everyone likes, money. And so in this case, the participants were rewarded with money for doing certain tasks. And on the right here, you can see the brain activation. Again, the red bar, teenagers, the gray bar are younger kids, and then the white bar, adults. So teenagers, higher brain activity, much higher in the nucleus accumbens when receiving the reward of money. So through hundreds of studies like this, there's a couple of things, conclusions that we've come to about what is happening in the reward system of the adolescent brain. We have seen that the nucleus accumbens actually physically gets larger, and then during adolescence, and then it starts to decrease in size as the person gets a little older into early adulthood. We see that baseline dopamine levels drop. This means that on average, teenagers are more easily bored. They need more stimulation to get them excited. We also see that dopamine release levels when dopamine is released are much higher. So the drive to receive rewards is much stronger. So this is higher highs and lower lows in the average teenage brain. And again, remember, we're just talking about statistical average here. You personally may be not the average teen, so some of this may not apply to you. Some of it may apply even more to you. So another thing that we've noticed is that new, or also called novel, experiences release even higher levels of dopamine. So this can have both, as many things, both positive and negative consequences. A positive consequence of this might be that it might cause one to try new things. It's called novelty-seeking behavior. A negative consequence is that it might cause excessively risky and sometimes dangerous behavior. So something that we'll see come up a lot in these studies, and as we're looking at the dynamic of the developing teenage brain, is a tendency towards sensation-seeking, risk-taking behavior, and particularly when it comes to new sensations or novelty-seeking behavior. So again, just a reminder that our reward system activates and works basically in same mechanism, not just for physical rewards like sugar or money, but other types of reward activate those same neural pathways in our brain. And what we've seen through dozens, if not hundreds of studies over the past 15 years as technology has emerged that allows us to measure these things, that in the average teen, this is especially true for social rewards. Teens in general, on average, really respond to social rewards. What might be an example of a social reward? Social media likes. And I'm going to stop right there, and we'll pick this up for next time. See you then. Bye-bye.